According to the people familiar with the talks, as U.S. and Cuban officials negotiated over the future of the communist-ruled and economically besieged Caribbean island, the Trump administration is seeking to push the current Cuban president out from power. Why do we seeing this change over and over again? And the question we really need to ask, what is the fascination and also what is the hunger from President Trump to the nation of Cuba? Looking at what's happening right now, especially regarding the war between U.S. and Iran at this moment, and despite what the sitting U.S. president has already claimed that U.S. won the war and promised would never put boots on the ground, in reality, it doesn't work that way. Again, the international communities are rather anxious, especially the NATO allies. How much can they trust the U.S. at this moment? And what about the word democracy? Is it just about the U.S. pep talk or perhaps a pat on the shoulder? Or President Trump is actually going to do some major damage? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Kurt Weyland. Professor Weyland's research interest focus on democratization and authoritarian rule, on social policy and policy diffusion, on populism in Latin America and Europe. And he done research in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Peru, and Venezuela. He's the author of this amazing book, The Politics of Market Reform in Fragile Democracies, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Venezuela. Well, Professor Weyland, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Well, Professor Weyland, I will say every time we talk to you, it's all about the Trump's fascination about the countries in Latin America. You know, it's one thing that we really ask, what is the hunger and the desire behind this person? But let's talk about this. Professor Weyland, as I mentioned in the intro, the Trump administration have been negotiating with officials in Cuba regarding the future of the country. And according to the latest report, that so far, sitting U.S. president and the Trump administration, it's not pushing for any actions against the Castro family members. Can you break it down and help us with better understanding why Cuba? We're looking at the chaos in Iran. We're looking at the uncertainty of the war in Ukraine. Cuba, what gives? Your thoughts?
So this goes back very, very long, right? Because since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cuba has been a thorn in the side of the United States. I mean, the United States, from the famous Monroe Doctrine onward, always wanted to make sure that extra-hemispheric great powers don't have a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And with the Cuban Revolution and with Cuba's very close alignment with the Soviet Union, that was broken. And so there is this wound, this sore on the American psyche for, more than 60 years. And President Trump is really trying to reassert American power in the Western Hemisphere. And you saw that with the capture of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. You even see that to some extent with his designs on Greenland. He wants to have, complete control over the Western Hemisphere. And so Cuba is such a long-standing annoyance for the United States. It's not really a threat anymore. It used to be more of a threat. Now it is just an annoyance and a leftover from the Cold War. And Donald Trump is determined finally to clean up and reassert American power. I also think, given his enormous attribution of his own importance, he might want to go into history as the US president who got rid of the Maduro regime, who got rid of the Cuban regime. And so you see these motivations. And I think there's also a strong other factor, which is that Foreign Minister and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, of course, is of Cuban descent and would very much like to liberate the island, partly as a ticket for a presidential run for 2028. That would be his kind of avenue. And so you see all these things coming together in the very strong pressure on Cuba. And of course, the capture of Maduro was an important step because that enabled Trump to cut Venezuela off of oil supplies. And not Venezuela, Cuba. So Cuba now is being strangled in having extreme difficulty with energy. Oil supply has been really minimalized because Trump also leaned on Mexico, and so the island is sinking into one blackout after the other. There have been protests already. The regime is on their ropes, and that allows Donald Trump to impose conditions on them.
Well, I mean, again, Professor Weyland, during the previous answer, you used the word called liberate. I mean, again, this has been one of the favorite vocabularies out of the mouth of President Trump. I mean, remember the days that he promised back in the days to liberate the people in Ukraine because of the war in Ukraine. And then when U.S. engaged with the war with Iran throughout the social media post, that Trump also said people in Iran must be liberated. I am looking at another news headline. Again, it says the sitting U.S. President Trump believes that current Cuban president must step down and it is time to allow the Cuban citizens to be liberated. Professor Weyland, you studied democracy your life, and then we look at the transformation of the countries, especially focused on Latin American regions. But today, again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but specifically, what does that mean to liberate when we talk about the relationship between U.S. and Cuba at this moment? Again, but is it actually Trump's job? I know this might be a cliche, but is it really Trump's job to liberate people in Cuba? I mean, again, is there any diplomatic reason, a personal reason, or perhaps economic reason to use that word nonchalantly? What do you say to that?
So there are several considerations. One, of course, there's a fundamental moral reason to liberate the people of Cuba who have been living under a repressive dictatorship for 65 years. And so anybody who is interested in democracy and freedom would hope that this communist regime in Cuba would finally give in and allow for personal freedom, allow for criticism, allow sooner or later for elections. So that is a very fundamental thing. However, a populist leader like President Trump uses terms in very, how should I say that? This is more kind of a rhetorical promise to win support. But you see that very clearly in the case of Venezuela, where after removing the kleptocratic president who was a real repressive dictator, Donald Trump has not pushed for democratization, but has allowed the whole power structure in Venezuela to keep governing the country, and has strikingly and blatantly and kind of almost ostentatiously marginalized the leader of the democratic opposition in Venezuela. And so that seems to be the same pattern that is currently being pursued in Cuba. And it is very interesting because I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio would really want to bring a regime change in Cuba for all kinds of reasons, whereas Donald Trump, who can be incredibly pragmatic and is not principle bound and does not have an inherent commitment to democracy, President Trump probably fears that a profound regime change could cause a whole bunch of trouble and turmoil, because an entrenched communist regime like in Cuba would somehow or other fight back, offer passive resistance, mess up the transition process. And so a democratic transition is always risky. And Donald Trump wants to avoid that. Trump has not an inherent stake in Cuba. He has not an inherent commitment to democracy. An added complication in the Cuban case that goes beyond the case of Venezuela is that a real liberation of Cuba might induce many exiled Cubans to return to the island and to claim property that they or their family lost in Fidel Castro's massive expropriations and nationalizations, and that could cause a ton of trouble and turmoil, exacerbating the difficulties of a democratic transition. And so that might be, unavoidable in the long run if you want to bring democracy to Cuba. But President Trump, at this point, doesn't have a long-term perspective. He has a very short-term perspective, which again is typical of populists, wants to avoid these risks, and is therefore willing to, while talking about liberation, not really pursuing liberation, pursuing something much more pragmatic, essentially breaking the independent will of the Cuban regime, subjugating it to his mandate, and then, claiming that he has finally dealt with this thorn in the side of the United States. By turning Cuba into a client state, how he's trying to do it with Venezuela.
Well, but Professor Weyland, correct me if I'm wrong, that regardless we call it regime change or, democratic change, cannot be a lone wolf job. I mean, it needs partners, and especially when we look at the complication of the world today. But again, you mentioned the word democracy back and forth. But according to the expert, today, when we look at the nation of Cuba, it's not just about this democratic system structure. There's another word. It's called the country is facing humanitarian crisis. I think today, though, when we look at a country, it's suffering under authoritarianism or suffer under dictatorship, it's obviously that people are suffering, especially we look at this economic standpoint. But going back to the country of Cuba, from humanitarian perspective, again, going back to the question, is it still America's job? I mean, right now, Trump's plate is pretty full at this moment. And also we don't even know what would happen to the midterm election. And when we look at the beginning of the war between Iran and America, even within Trump's party, people totally disagree with him. And also there are so many younger generations are rather outspoken about the war between US and Iran at this moment. So again, going back to the point, if let's just say hypothetically, if U.S. were to intervene on Cuba from humanitarian perspective, is it going to make better sense? Or perhaps that right now it's better for U.S. to leave it alone. Not only talk about that democracy, but let's forget about the humanitarian, forget about democracy. Let's just need to have a genuine assessment about what's happening in the country today. What do you say to that?
So when you think of it, the United States pressure on Cuba does not take very much exertion on the part of the US. I mean, by intervening in Venezuela, they've cut off the Venezuelan oil supply. Donald Trump has leaned on Mexico to cut off Mexico's oil supply to Cuba. Now, a Russian tanker just landed and brought some fuel to Cuba. But for the United States, it does not take very much to maintain this strangulation of Cuba. And so Donald Trump can pursue this, with a little finger of his left hand while he uses the rest of all his arsenal to deal with Iran. That is the real massive crisis at this current point that I have no idea how Donald Trump will get himself out of. But dealing with Cuba is a sideshow that the United States can pursue at the same time. That is really not a problem. And of course, the deal that the United States is offering, they're not planning, and I don't think they really intend to intervene militarily in Cuba. It is an economic strangulation where the exacerbation of Cuba's humanitarian crisis is a bargaining chip to say you have to give in, and you have, so the Cuban leadership, you have to concede to American demands and do what we want. And if you do that, then we will lift that strangulation. And then if you have over time some economic normalization with the US, we can have tourists come in, we can have investment, we can have, we can help pull Cuba out of its deep economic crisis, which is, of course, what is also being pursued in Venezuela. Because by leaning on Delcy Rodriguez to change the oil law and oil property arrangement and now the minerals law, all of that prepares the influx of American investment that could help pull Venezuela out of its own deep economic decline. And so I think that is the deal that is being offered. So in Cuba, we can press you to the wall unless you give in. And once you give in, we release our grip, and then things can have an upswing, by negotiating with members of the Castro clan. That also means the main power structure can stay in place for now. We are not demanding that you give up your perks and your power, that you expose yourself to potential legal risks. If you play ball with us, you can maintain your grip, not in that dictatorial, repressive way as you've done so far, but you can stay in power, enjoy all of that. And at the same time, we can kind of trace a path for Cuba's gradual economic recovery. And that would benefit the pragmatic goals of Donald Trump. He could still say, we turned Cuba around. It would benefit, not benefit, but it would let the Castro family off the hook. And so in a similar kind of strange pragmatic deal as Donald Trump has forged it with Delcy Rodriguez and the Chavista power structure in Venezuela. A very unusual, not about democracy, not about regime change, not about real liberation, but essentially kind of a deal that gives both sides their short-term, second, third best goals. And so I think that would be the most likely outcome.
Professor Weyland, two more questions before letting you go. Now, according to Trump administration's officials, when it comes to Cuba and also this interest in Cuba, this is the way that how the officials interpreted Trump's approach, and I quote, "We control our hemisphere. We have the ability to do this. We want these hostile regimes out of our hemisphere. We are going to set up the business community because we don't believe in democracy," end quote. This is a very alarming and a dangerous statement because, again, Professor Weyland, you're the expert. You know that in order to have negotiation or in order to have the success of conversation, that you have to bring in the strategy of diplomacy. But it doesn't look like the Trump administration, they're running on this track. So again, you study populism all your life, and also you mentioned about, the danger of dictatorship and authoritarianism. We're looking at all the options. But today, again, correct me if I'm wrong, the word diplomacy doesn't really play a strong impact or picture in Trump administration. They believe business deals. They believe tit for tat. I scratch yours and you scratch mine. But when it comes to diplomacy, it doesn't work that way. There has to be compromise. There has to be negotiation. Or even, I dare to use the word sacrifice. What do you say to that about what's happening right now?
So I think you have a very important point, because what Donald Trump does, especially in the Western Hemisphere, is, if you want to use an informal term, push American power around, push his might around, right? So this is not diplomacy, we'll find a deal, but like, I'm the big hegemon and you better concede. But of course, even with the exercise of power, there's ultimately some element of diplomacy. And you saw that in the negotiation of that very strange deal with Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. And you see that now. There is a lot of US pressure on Cuba, but their negotiations, what do we want? What can we live with? What does the US really demand? What can the Cuban Castro clan live with? They can sacrifice Miguel Diaz-Canel. They can give up on complete state ownership. They can try to make accommodations to American demands. All of that is diplomacy. So diplomacy does play a role. It's not the main instrument. The main kind of instrument is power and a fairly crude exertion of power. And then in the Trump administration, since he comes from the business world, there's also a lot of trust in business in Venezuela and in Cuba. Now, of course, the United States has long been committed to what in the social sciences you call modernization theory. And the idea there is, if you stimulate economic development, especially in a more market-oriented private ownership way, then this economic development sooner or later will produce societal pluralism, will produce demands for political voice. that, more openness, business will become independent of the state, they will want to have rule of law and legal security, they want to have elections. And so I think one element in this whole equation is the assumption in the US that sooner or later, if you straighten out a country's economy, if you integrate that country with the US, which is based on market capitalism, if you let American business in, sooner or later, this country will kind of be put on the path towards democracy. I think that is another element in this. And so I agree with you that a lot of it is kind of power and then business, but from the US perspective, that assumption, democracy is not sort of excluded. You see that also in like Marco Rubio's testimony before the Senate when they were pressing him about democracy in elections. And he said, well, not right now, but, we assume that sooner or later that might end up being on the agenda.
Well, Professor Weyland, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, going back to what's happening right now, the war between Iran and U.S. at this moment. Again, despite what the sitting U.S. President Trump has posted or has said during numerous occasions that the war between the two countries has been completed, but experts don't really believe in that way because based on the latest report, the U.S. government are still interested in sending more troops to the Middle East. This is rather conflicting with what President Trump has said or what he has posted. But again, going back to the question I asked you before, it's called the grand strategy, especially this ongoing tension between U.S. and NATO allies at this moment. Last time you and I, we talked about what's happening in the nation of Germany, and also we talk about in France, etc. But couple country leaders, Germany, Spain, and also Britain, are very, very outspoken and straightforward about not involved in the war between U.S. and Iran. And also, they're not interested in helping a bit. Of course, Trump is not happy about that. As a matter of fact, and experts believe there could be a possibility that under Trump, U.S. can pull out of NATO. So it's saying you're not treating us fairly. Why am I doing this? Again, I know it's hypothetical, but again, Professor Weyland, from your perspective, what do you make of the attitude from the NATO ally members? And also, why do you think that Donald Trump is so disappointed or pissed about their attitude? Is it really about, I'm not getting my share, I'm not getting my help, I'm not getting my support, and therefore, I'm not going to play the game fairly anymore? Your final thoughts?
As far as I can see, Donald Trump started this war with Iran without being prepared, without having thought this through systematically, without taking into account fairly easily foreseeable contingencies. And so the informal term would be he's shooting from the hip, right? Just like, I succeeded in Venezuela, and now let's try Iran, bomb them for a week or two, and they'll give in, and I will have a victory. And surprise, surprise, it didn't happen like that. And you see on so many occasions that Donald Trump had no idea what he was getting himself into. Even like when there was suddenly, oh my God, we have to evacuate all these Americans from the Middle East, but we don't have the planes, and how do you do it? And the airports are closed. I mean, you saw chaos right from early on. And you see that while the United States and Israel have a phenomenal superiority in regular weaponry and have smashed Iran's military apparatus, Iran, on the other hand, with its little drones, has a great ability to hold global oil supply hostage. And that was, I think, also not anticipated. It should be easy to anticipate for anybody who looks at the map and sees the Strait of Hormuz. But once again, it seems that didn't really occur, that risk to Donald Trump. And so he got himself into something that is much bigger and much more complicated and much less easily winnable than he had thought. And he's desperate to get out of that for all kinds of reasons. Among them, the midterms were nowadays, even the Senate is at play, So that is the reason why I think in a mix of wishful thinking and just usual Trumpian deception, he's saying, oh, the war is won and the Iranians are desperate to negotiate and they're offering all this kind of thing. And the Iranians say, nothing. We're not talking. We have no problem. We can keep going. And I gather from experts, every day that this war continues, the balance of kind of strategic success shifts to the Iranian side, because the Americans and Israelis keep bombing and keep killing top Iranian leaders, and it doesn't really stop the Iranian capacity to interrupt a good part of global oil supplies. And so I think that is what is going on. The Europeans, I think anybody who is halfway prepared sees, for example, the Strait of Hormuz, knows that Iran has tons of drones that are cheap and can cause a lot of damage. I think these Europeans who are, listen to experts are better prepared. They see like, what is the man getting himself into? They don't want to be involved in this, partly because, of course, they are much more dependent on oil supply from the Persian Gulf than the United States. And so they are cautious. They want to stay out of it. They run foreign policy in a prepared, expert-based, systematic way, not like a populist leader who shoots from the hip. And so, now Donald Trump at some point threatened them with consequences if they didn't support him, but he has backed off from that. So I think there is a limit, probably less by Donald Trump himself, but the remaining foreign policy and military apparatus, a limit with really getting into a direct open conflict with NATO, like the US pulling out of NATO. And you saw that when he backed off from that crazy idea of taking over Greenland. And so I'm actually at this point not concerned that like NATO would fall apart or that the United States would abandon NATO. I think that would be too much, US foreign policy and military strategy for the last 80 years or 75 years has been based on NATO. There are a ton of NATO troops in Europe. You're not letting one man just kind of rip that up in one of his whims. So in that sense, I think there's still some restraint on Donald Trump's populism and his tendency to just make decisions however he thinks in the moment they should be done. So.
Well, again, Professor Weyland, you said it, and I agree with you 100%. I think today we're not looking for surprises. We're not looking for insanity. And we're looking for stability. And also, of course, within the international community, just two words, make sense. Everything gonna make sense so that everyone can participate and willing to put the effort. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Kurt Weyland. Again, Professor Weyland's research interest focus on democratization and authoritarian rule, on social policy and the policy diffusion. He's expert and the research extended in the countries of Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Venezuela, and so forth. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to connect with Professor Weyland. Again, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I would love to have you back on the show as we continue our attention and also our interest in the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.